The martial arts of the whole Spartacus series. There were so many different fighting styles introduced in this series that I actually lost count. And there were quite a few special ones in the pits of the Underworld, which you would normally miss out on, but not in this video. Which one should we begin with? Let's begin with Murmillo. The Murmillo fighting style is basically used by every new recruit in the Ludus as they begin their gladiatorial training, which was seen with Animes, Spartacus, Varro, Gnaeus, Crixus, yeah. You basically fight with a sword and shield and maximize your potential with said fighting style. Murmillo is a gladiator fighting style that represents the Roman legion. It is the oldest fighting style and the first to use the gladiator sword as its primary weapon. The Murmillo is the most popular of all styles because it is classed as the hometown hero. The shield of the Murmillo is actually called scutum, a big rectangular shield, and aside the shield and gladius the sword, you also have a balteis, a leather belt with metal decorations and supplements, similar to current boxing belts today, for example, especially designed for a Murmillo. The so-called manica is the armor on your arm, segmented or scaled arm guard made of leather or some other metal alloys. Manica can also be chainmailed for extra protection as seen with Crixus. You got the Classica Crista, the helmet used by Murmillo specifically, shin guards called the Ocria, and lastly Fastiae. These are paddings along worn with the shin guards such as on Crixus. The Murmillo fighting style was suited for men with large muscular arms and strong heavy shoulders needed to help him carry the weight of the fucking big shield and sword. Men who played the Murmillo were shorter and more agile than most other gladiators, such as with Crixus for example. Next up we have the Thraex. Thraex were gladiators inspired by Thracian warriors. They typically wore a distinctive round or square-shaped helmet with a griffin crest and a small round shield called a parmula. Their primary weapon was a short sword called the sika, which had a curved blade designed for slashing attacks. It is slightly different than the gladius sword and mainly seen from Spartacus in his Thracian days. And the Murmillo and Thraex fighting style get mixed up because they look so fucking similar. Anyways, next up we have the Retiari. Retiari were gladiators who fought with a net and trident. They usually wore minimal armor, allowing them greater mobility in the arena. The Retiaris would try to ensnare their opponents with the net and then strike with the trident. He would rely on evasive tactics to stay out of range of the weapon of his opponent. The net was intended to basically compensate for the lack of armor, while the dagger, called pugio, was used to finish off defeated opponents. To cut the net as well though. For example, if you would become entangled on the Retiaris, on your own fucking net, however that would be, but anyways. Or the dagger would also be used as a last resort should the trident be lost. Gnaeus was the only one seen to have been wielding this style because he was too unskilled with sword and shield. Next up we have the Hopplomachus. The Hopplomachus gladiators were based on Greek hoplites. They fought with a spear, a small round shield, a helmet with a crest, and often wore greaves, meaning leg protectors. The Hopplomachus was known for his defensive tactics and relied on the spear's reach to attack from a distance. It's the style which Barca mainly used, and he was assigned this later after Gods of the Arena as well. Similar to Gnaeus, as it seemed to simply suit him better because of his height and size. Actually, it was within Gods of the Arena, not after, when he was assigned this fighting style, just to clarify. Next up we have the Dimachaerus fighting style. Dimachaerus were gladiators who fought with two swords, one in each hand. They were skilled in dual wielding techniques and focused on quick and agile strikes. Dimachaeri typically wore minimal armor to enhance their speed and flexibility, which is the main purpose. To add heavy armor on top of it would come for a disadvantage, as you lose speed as well as agility and you have nothing to defend yourself with, only the two swords. Someone who is heavy with heavy armor and a big two-handed sword could easily, for example, strike you down. Next up we have the Secutor. Secutores were heavily armed gladiators who were typically paired against Retiari. They wore a rounded helmet with a narrow eye slot for protection and visibility. Their primary weapon was a short sword similar to the Gladius, and they carried a large shield. You might think Murmillo and Secutor look exactly the same as seen with Cerberus and Crixus, for example, but there's a vital difference. Secutores were heavily armed gladiators who were typically paired against Retiari. That is the main difference between the Murmillo and the Secutor. Next up we have the Provokator, and as the name says it, the Provokator style was a variation of Murmillo. Provocatores were heavily armed gladiators who often fought other Provocatores or Murmillos. They wore a helmet with a tall crest, similar to the Murmillo, and used a gladius and scutum. The fight between Provocatores was often a display of skill and endurance, but this fighting style was barely, if at all, seen in the series, I think. At some point it was though, don't remember which episode it was. Next up we have the Sagittarius. Sagittari were gladiators who specialized in archery. They would enter the arena with a bow and a quiver of arrows, using their marksmanship skills to attack opponents from a distance. Sagittari were typically light on armor to maintain mobility, and the best example in the series of the fighting style would be Mira, as she wore light armor to stay mobile and mainly fought from the distance with a bow. Now, aside from the main used fighting styles, there were also quite a few interesting styles displayed in the pits of the Underworld and not used within the arena itself. Murmillo, for example, is gifted with spike-knuckled Spirai, which is basically a fighting style where you have two knuckles. And Spartacus has a very similar fighting style, because he also was gifted crude brass knuckle styled knuckles to fight, and they were called Kestis. Both quite resemble each other's styles. The two swords, the Dimachaerus fighting style, for example, resembles the Kestus fighting style the two knuckles Spartacus had received, because in both you have two of the same weapons and you fight in close combat, with the difference being that in one you have two swords and in one you have two knuckles. Next up we have the Malaise fighting style. This is a style where you basically wield a big sledgehammer, as seen with Ixion, who fought against Curza. You don't wear much armor basically to protect your upper body or such, and your hits are guaranteed most of the time to hit with the heavy hammer to finish opponents off quickly. Of course, you gotta be strong as hell like Ixion to actually wield such a weapon. Next up we have Vinculum, in which the wielder is a chain. This is a fighting style where you basically fight with a chain, and you also have the ability to attach something like a spiked round ball to the end of the chain to enhance your fighting styles and your deathly blows. And you also don't wear much armor with this style either. And there were also a few fighting styles where people used axes and a few other weapons in the pits, but I couldn't really assign any specific fighting style name for these or find out anything about them. And the best example of this we have is in Spartacus' last fight, for example, where he saved Boreas' life with an axe, and the axe was his opponent's weapon. And I don't know which fighting style that is, to be honest. Couldn't find any name of it. Anyways, these were all fighting styles used within the series and displayed in Spartacus, and quite a few resembled each other, but they have quite a few differences after all. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video, and please forgive my pronunciation for some of these styles, and I'll see you on my next Spartacus video.